update. It's now just on 6 months since lockdown. Working from home has been urged. And here I've got all the links for, I put them up the first time, past videos are here on Brian's site. There's a nice archive here done by Simon Still. And here's the RDRF website, original article there. Last week's presentation is there. Do email me on chairrdrf@aol.com for anything you want to go in. A lot of people are doing that. Try and get it in by the day before. And if there are any special requests, as some people also do that, and I can send them stuff. So here's some news. I'm generally not doing news from abroad because we've got enough going on or not going on here, but there to take a look at that. That's under Annie Hidalgo, 60,000 car parking spaces to new green space, as well as cycle parking, etc. You compare that with what's happening in, admittedly, it's more difficult for London and the other big cities, but, how much is going on with that kind of spirit where you live in the UK? Now that is quite nice. Notice 3 car parking spaces taken outside a cafe in Clapham in Lambeth. 3 car parking spaces. And otherwise, what's the big news from the government? It's giving 1 million to doctor bikes nationally and 1 million on walk to school. And I've left a great big white space there because I think that's pretty pathetic. When I costed what a good quality direct support for cycling scheme should cost, it would be about £1 million for each London borough. And, this is what we're getting nationally. Yeah, I mean, that would be kind of quite reasonable for London, but, it's just not at the scale of what we require. Okay, now, here are some statistics. That's the government link. I got those from hat tip to the guy in Oxfordshire. And what I've done is I've done some highlighting here. The reds are the weekends. And this is all compared with last year, 2019, for the relevant day in September. When it says 100%, it means the same as last year, not doubled from last year. So you can see that cars are about back to normal, bit more at weekends, same with vans, same with lorries, rails only about 1/3 as much, TfL tube the same, TfL buses up to nearly about 60%. And the same outside London. Now cycling, let's concentrate on that. If you look at the weekends, you're well up, about 2/3 more, sometimes nearly twice as much as last year. I did a quick average of the weekly ones. These figures are much more dubious for the reasons you should know about. They're much more difficult to calculate. But I did an average of the last 10 days, 10 weekdays that we've got data for, and it's about 24% up on last year, which is, better than nothing, but it's been a warm September. And when you think about what could have been done over the last 6 months, when you think we should be aiming to be doubling cycling, at least in line with the government asks and TfL targets, it's really not good enough, in my view. Okay, now there's quite a lot. The main thing I'm going to be talking about this week is about the battle of ideas, not so much as usual on stuff that's gone on the ground, although there will be some of that. Okay, here is the evidence on the effects of major investment in active travel in outer London by Rachel Aldred, James Woodcock and Anna Goodman. That's something for you to read. I've mentioned that one before, but you need to read that. Now this from Creds by Professor Alan Annable is on the Climate Assembly UK, and I've talked about it before, and I say that I said last week I was pretty disappointed with them not being prepared to have behaviour change with regard to car travel. Gillian Annable is very good, very radical. She takes a sort of, more kind of well-rounded approach, and you definitely do have to read through this. There's a London update for mid-September from Simon Monk. Take a look at that. Nice hints on riding to work from Cycling UK. And there's a report from Centre for London about possible scenarios for London in the future. Take a look at figure 10 there, and it shows that really since TfL came into being at the beginning of the century, we've not really had any good modal shift from cars. Certainly no significant increases in cycling. Cycling's gone up from about 1.2 to 2.5% over nearly 20 years. Not good enough, London. Right, this is a big piece of news from this week. It's a report referred to as incorporating really important work by Andy, now a Detective Chief Inspector Andy Cox, formerly Detective Superintendent of the Met's Roads and Traffic Police. It's done by the Active Travel Academy at Westminster University here, and you can read a good account of it, including with a quote from yours truly in Forbes by Carlton Reid. And it's about how the press reports road crashes, how it reports interactions with cyclists, and it's calling for differences which you need to look at. I have suggested to Brian we might even have a session on this at some stage in the future on Ideas with Beers. In the meantime, if you can't read the whole report, read this. Nice column in a Bristol newspaper, easily read by Steve Melia. He's not a professor yet. Good on transport from University of West of England. And another good article by Mark, the ranty highwayman, and he's talking about cycling in town centres, which Brian did a session on recently, and he's saying it's a network issue. Right, here's something from Devon and Cornwall Police. And they do your rights and responsibilities on a bicycle. Now, I'm personally, I'm not a sort of against the rights and responsibilities approach, but I'm not really happy with this, and I don't think you should be either. They do talk about the highway code, good points. Use the cycle lanes not compulsory. Cycle lanes are not for cars or if there's a solid white line. And in line with the way the highway code is now developing, you have the right to careful and considerate treatment from drivers, at least as much space on the road as a car, and the same right to use the road as every other road user. Very good. Be confident but courteous. Well, yeah, okay. Ride with pride. Cycling is part of the solution, not part of the problem. Okay, that's okay. Now let's have a look at your responsibilities. Okay, always wear an approved cycle helmet. It could save your life. Well, we know about that. Wearing high visibility clothing. No, it's about motorists looking where they're going. Be polite. Well, you know, I don't think you should go around being impolite, and I like being courteous, but that's not actually about what leads to people being hurt or killed on the road. And here we go. Cycle with a smile and be an ambassador for the bike. Now, you see, here, people like me say, would you say that to a motorist? You know, why am I supposed to be responsible for all other cyclists? You know, why not go to drivers and say, hey, drive carefully so that you don't give other drivers a bad name? You know, they're not doing it. Stick to the rules of the road. Well, yeah, okay, but you know, why do it? Now, there's loads of advice you could give. You could point out about the whole business of taking primary position where it's appropriate. You could talk about more about the fact that of what motorists should do in terms of giving you enough room when they overtake. You could talk about reporting to the police through dash cam and helmet cams and light cams. You could do these things. Now, the good thing about all this is that when people in authority say these things, there is a big pile on Twitter. And I'm pleased to see that. And I really do think that we need to do that. And I do hope some police officers are getting the message. Because, of course, as someone said, are you saying that to motorists? You know, they're the ones who count. And we were saying that, and the, I think it was Chief Inspector or Chief Superintendent Leask from Devon and Cornwall, I invited him to come on Ideas with Beers. I don't know if he got in touch with Brian. We said, are you saying this to motorists? And he said, well, I don't want to get binary. I don't want to turn it into them and us. Well, that's actually what you're doing by operating in this way. And yes, there are some things that we all have a responsibility for. That's not endangering other people. And that really has to be addressed primarily to the motorized road users. Okay, so this stuff is still going on there. And also from the same part of the world, what do we get? Oh God, this is from Devon Alert. You know, get your reflective environment stuff. There is no excuse for not being seen. Yeah, well, there isn't an excuse if the people who have a responsibility to see you are looking where they're going and watching out. So again, good to see that they got a big reaction on Twitter, not the one which I think they'd wanted, but I hope they've learned some lessons from that. Now, here's a thread from someone called Adam Alton, and I want to spend a bit of time on it. Fewer deaths in London have been caused by COVID-19 than are lost due to air pollution each year. That's noxious emissions, air quality. And he's gone through the figures. I'll whip through this fairly quickly, but you should try and have a look at his thread. 6,000 hospital deaths. This was from his tweet last week. So 8,455 total London COVID deaths. The King's College report put that at about 9,416 annual London air pollution deaths. It's been criticized with some stuff in local transport today, but you can see it's of a roughly similar order. And he says, are these deaths caused by these factors or are they just premature deaths? Whether underlying health conditions, etc. And he said, no, these are not just slightly premature due to air pollution. It's calculated by taking total life years lost and making a figure of equivalent deaths. So this is all the area of cost benefit analysis, and why I said at the beginning, and I was quite honest about this, it's never about the numbers, it's about the morality. He said if we'd not taken action on COVID figure would of course be much higher. And that in fact these are figures for the whole year, so you can bring them down to actually being at about 6,700, which is a bit less than COVID, but of roughly the same order. And he says it's happening every year, so maybe we should do something about it. So I'll leave that with you. It's something to say we need to do stuff about noxious emissions. Okay, so now let's just focus on the whole battle of ideas. Repeat that you should follow tweeters like Danny Williams, Paul Gannon in London to keep abreast of developments, and others elsewhere. Okay, so we've had this vandalism in Hackney, and that's quite serious. I don't know if the idiots think that that's an actual camera, but serious vandalism. We've also had a tweeter comparing LTNs to gas chambers. Note on the Mythbuster there, and petitions being signed in Southport against pop-up cycle lanes. So let's go to Southport, and it's a good typical case study. Apart from the guy involved, who is someone called Sinclair Hesketh d'Albuquerque. I thought that was some kind of joke name, but this restaurant, Rooters, actually exists, or at least their website does. And he's behind one of the petitions, and he says, no consultation. Well, we've heard that before. The trial is a form of consultation. Decisions have been made by the council who have not even visited the road. Well, yeah, they would have had to if they're going to put measures in. You are highly unlikely to come on your bike. Well, we've got all the figures on how people do lots of shopping by foot and by bike. The traffic was never at a level to make it dangerous to cyclists. Well, I don't know what kind of measures he's using and what kind of expert he is on measuring road danger. Very few cyclists. Well, we've heard that with every cycle lane that's ever gone in, and actually they do tend to fill up. Where are vehicles supposed to park? That's one of the things that we talked about, or was talked about in the language report. Vehicles don't park, their drivers do. And where are they supposed to park? Well, yeah, that's one of the reasons you're having them. You don't want so many people to drive. And these are my emphases from the report in Stand Up for Southport. Okay, and the next bit of pushback, bike lash, whatever you want to call it, is in Wallasey on Merseyside. There is a fundraiser to say no to cycle lanes from a member of the Conservative Party. I think he's a councillor, I'm not quite sure. But that's happening in Merseyside. And here's the hate mail. This is about Ealing Council, I mentioned a lot. Labour Council leader admits plan to take advantage of COVID by making temporary road closures and cycle lanes permanent, in capital letters. How bad could that be? To be like Copenhagen. And of course, the government, a Conservative government, Daily Mail, did talk about them being permanent at the end of the trial when all this came out in May. So you didn't get the memo from Mr. Gilligan or Mr. Johnson or Mr. Shapps. Right, now this is what happened in Hackney. Councillor John Burt, a very good environment person there, is referring to hate mail coming through saying that the anti-low traffic neighbourhood campaigners are responsible for the creation of an atmosphere in which public property is destroyed and we receive death threats for doing the job we were democratically elected to do. Here it is, you fucking cunts, you fucking cunt, we're going to burn down your house, use violence against your kids, you fucking cunts, you ride a bicycle. Yes, spelt wrong, would you believe it? And Simon Monk gave a nice reply in a thread saying, okay, you don't like them, you're rubbishing the evidence, saying, yeah, we need to do something else first. You do astroturfing, anonymous accounts. And he's saying, this is down to you, you know, you have to, you're lying, misrepresenting evidence, engaging in abuse, and they're not coming up with any alternatives. They're standing with and collaborating with people who poison planters, drive massive diesel SUVs proudly down main roads, put down tax on benches and other things. And they're standing with folks who make these ludicrous analogies. And these schemes are being put in by democratically elected government mandate, by councils who have these approaches written into manifestos and policies. They're schemes which are trials, which will be consulted on, and many have been widely engaged on already. So, you know, look at your fellow opposition. Is that really who you want to be siding with? And this was very much a taking the moral high ground thread. So, example to us all from Simon Monk. There's a counter protest, which I put, well, there isn't a counter protest, but I'd say counter protest query, because Hackney, they're protesting on Thursday at 4 p.m., 7 p.m. against horrendous Hackney road closures. Wow, how did they think that up? So I'm just suggesting, how about a counter protest? How about lots of Hackneyites cycling around outside Hackney Town Hall saying we like them, we think they're wonderful? You know, I don't know. It's just my suggestion, up to the people who live there. It wouldn't be like trying to organize a big march, but, you know, why not have or entertain the idea of having a counter protest? I put that out to Hackney Living Streets, Hackney Cycling Campaign, Hackney Cyclist, Hackney Green Party, and all the rest of you people. Here's a little bit of data to be used in your campaigning. Fire brigade attendance times in Waltham Forest after the first mini Holland was implemented. And you can see between 2005 and last year, first appliance attendance time has gone down. So there are some facts for you to use, along with this central thing that I raised last week, that in London, the number of miles done by motor vehicles on side roads has nearly doubled because of the use of Waze and other route guidance systems. Nothing new on the diversity page. The delay slide. Yes, this, I have to say, is once again the theme of the week. It's now 6 months since lockdown, and this is the 4th time I'm repeating Alex Ingram's tweet. 80% of the government's announced £225 million for walking and cycling has not yet been formally allocated. And we were told that it would happen in early September. Okay, well, it's late September and it hasn't happened. So that's bad nationally. Okay, on the ground in the UK, it all depends where you live. in Leicester. Now, I picked this up, Belgrave Gate North, before and after. And I said, well, you know, is that a big improvement? You seem to have to defer to pedestrians there. It's in the middle of the road. Is that helpful? Couldn't it have been done in a different way? Did we need that extra for pedestrians? Couldn't we have had cycle lanes? Whatever. And there was quite a big toing and froing on Twitter between people who say, oh, actually it is an improvement, and others who needed more convincing. But anyway, it's a bit like Velvet Underground. If I stimulate debate and discussion, that's good. It also is a quick reminder that I don't actually know exactly what it's like in all cases. I have enough problems with the schemes that are actually quite local to me, where I know what it's like on the ground. Oh, right. Okay. Exeter in Wanford Road. There was a news item about how Casper Hughes recorded 14 cars driving the wrong way down what they call a pop-up cycleway, but it's actually a low traffic neighborhood. 14 cars driving in just 35 minutes. Casper reported them. That went in the local paper. Right. Nottingham. Orange advisory cycle lanes have gone in. Orange. That's never happened before anywhere. Orange advisory cycle lanes, you can see them there as well, with emergency active travel funding, which shouldn't have happened. So I also notice here's a median strip. Looks like a refuge there. Surely we would like to see that narrowed, maybe have a white, unbroken, solid white line there, perhaps double whites, more space, and have some kind of segregated, protected infrastructure there. But that hasn't happened in Nottingham. And, you know, it's just gone in 6 months after stuff, you know, after lockdown, 3 months after all the discussion about what was wanted, and it's the wrong color, it's advisory cycle lanes, and, you know, that's really not good enough. Shropshire, now the council has unanimously supported enshrining LTN 120 into plans for any future active travel projects. It's a cross-party motion with the Greens, Labour, Lib Dems. So it's a formal endorsement of LTN 120 and the gear change document. I don't know how much difference that'll make. I don't know if we should campaign for local councils to do that. It could kind of give some sort of additional formal support from the council, and to draw their attention to it when they don't do the right thing. Aberdeen, oh dear. Bike lanes have been scrapped. That's a place where they just had some road building, worried about congestion. A nice objective report saying sigh of relief. Oh yeah. Suffolk, some new cycle lanes will be finished this week. Now, Mark Treasure tweeted this from Horsham, Albion Way. There's a big protected cycle lane there, and he said he likes referring to that when people say, oh, how do emergency services get through when you have cycle lanes? Well, they can use the cycle lane. But there is a problem that it's only one way and people are cycling on the pavement coming back the other direction, or else they're cycling down the cycle lane and ending up in the wrong position on a roundabout. Right, now here's something I got from Danny Williams. It's one of the consultations from TfL on the A24. Now, this is important because look at the wording. With social distancing requirements still in place on public transport, congestion levels across London will continue to rise if trips previously made by public transport were instead made by car. We must give people an alternative way to travel. That's their emphasis. We completely understand that some journeys can't be made on foot or bike, but many can. By helping people who can do so to walk or cycle more often, we can free up buses and trains for people who need them most. And we can ensure our roads are as free-flowing as possible for the emergency services, businesses, and buses and taxis. I'm reading all this out because this is the kind of wording that a local authority should be having. NHS link between personal fitness and recovery from coronavirus. Increase in trips made by car would also worsen air quality. I'm not sure about the increase in road casualties, but they could say increased road danger. We've said previously that this number of people cycling were hurt in collisions. So this is why we need to do something for cycling. This consultation is about cycle lanes, by the way. An increase in trips by car will add congestion to our roads, delay local buses, etc., etc. More traffic on London's roads is not the solution to help London recover from the pandemic, but active travel through walking and cycling is. I would have personally preferred them to say more motor traffic, but this is just excellent wording from an official body, and highway authorities everywhere should be doing this. As Danny Williams says, it's pulling no punches. On the ground in London, I mentioned the bollards at filters are being replaced by NPR cameras. The reason is to facilitate emergency vehicle access. Thanks, Martin Gorst. And Hackney, they've got bike buddies here. I really would like to have seen more stuff like this, more direct support for cycling, more accompanying new cyclists. It's the kind of thing that could have been done with cycle trainers from word go. It really hasn't happened enough. It's one of the many things where action could have been taken, should have been taken, and hasn't been enough. And it's now being left largely to volunteers. 4 LTNs in Harrow being led by a councillor who's quite bullish. That's good to see. Right, now Royal Parks introduced 20-mile-an-hour limit. I'm anxious to see what that'll be like on the Regent's Park outer circle. When you get 20 miles an hour, people will start saying, oh, will it apply to cyclists? And there is an issue in Regent's Park that the outer circle is used by club cyclists, racing cyclists who do actually get up to speeds of about 25 miles an hour. I personally think this, when people start talking about why doesn't it apply to cyclists, speed limits don't apply generally to cyclists, although the new 15-mile-an-hour one in City of London might do. I personally tend to dig my heels in here. I don't think you should ride it over 20 miles an hour if motor traffic is being required to slow down to 20. But it's important to say that there's a reason why the limit doesn't apply to you. And it's not just because cyclists don't have to have speedometers or computers. It's because of the whole thing about potential kinetic energy dispersed on impact. That's why we need lower speed limits. That's why we need motorists to be going below 20 miles an hour where there are people walking and cycling. So I think it's a good time for awareness about why speed limits don't apply to cyclists. It's not just about the measurements issues. It's about potential kinetic energy dispersed on impact, which is less if you have lower mass, lower weight. This is Kew Road in Richmond, new cycle lane. Apparently, TfL have said that the wands and orcas or mini orcas they're stuck into have to be on the inside of the solid white line. I don't know why exactly, but you do use a few centimeters, but that apparently is the way it is. Ice Cream Man's just come. Okay, so there's your campaigns and reading. The main things I told you to read are earlier on in the presentation, nothing much new. Don't forget highway code review and pavement parking. Highway code review, the big one. And this webinar I mentioned last week, Thursday, 8th of October. And I can tell you there will be a special event on 22nd of October. I will give you details next week. And finally, here's a nice bit of sub-advertising. Time to get out and walk before you have to swim. Okay.
I'll move straight on from the publicity shot to the publicity shot. Were you talking about this earlier, Brian?
I don't think so.
Okay, so
yeah.
Ross Atkins with Brian, we're talking about. So obviously he's trying to fight back. Sarah Berry's got all the branding with Simon Still on the road open signs. So we produced a bunch of beer mats for Ideas with Beers. Why wouldn't we? We did that with Ross Atkin, and maybe Brian will say something about this later, but we just thought it'd be fun for to get these out if you wanted some. There is a box on Brian's desk that he hasn't been to for months at the moment, and we'd be very happy to get them around to contributors who might feel they need to protect their desks during these sacred Tuesday hours. But I've been asked to talk about principally tactile paving, but I'll touch on some broader inclusive design issues, and that's partly because I've been involved in updating the guidance on the use of tactile paving surfaces for the Department for Transport. Brian, just wanted to check, are these coming up, these slides delayed, or are they okay?
You're Sorry, good. You're all Steve, good.
Yep. We have just started the third and final phase of updating this tactile paving guidance. Well, I say we have. This is part of a team with I'm part of a team with TRL. It's not just looking at updating the tactile paving guidance, but it's also looking at updating inclusive mobility. Both of them are the best part 15, 20 years old. Depending on where you download these documents from, they can have different dates. When they've got dates, certainly for the tactile paving surfaces, any dates later than 1998, that's just incredibly, maybe a slightly different publication version or so forth, but the actual tactile paving guidance itself, the substance of it is over 20 years old. And that's one of the reasons why it needs updating. So there's a bunch of stuff in it that's, yeah, frankly, just time expired, classic stuff, you know. Please get in touch with organizations that don't exist anymore. But the critical thing from my perspective, and indeed from the DFTs, is the fact that tactile paving provision, the practice, the implementation of it is, shall we say, inconsistent is probably the kindest way to describe that. And I think there's a recognition that the guidance itself may just possibly be part of the problem. I say that, I suppose, from the, and you know, one way of talking about that is when you consider the tactile paving, there are a few types of surface, but it's just one dimension of a of the street scene. The guidance itself is about, depending on whether you've got a large print or small print version, is between around 85 and 102 pages long. It's a huge booklet about something that's really quite specific and small. And it's sort of, as a lot of people that we spoke to said when we were speaking to them about it, so that, you know, there's a really simple, some good principles, and then it grows arms and legs, which is a summary, but also the phrase that was used by a few people we spoke to. It's just, and the problem with that is you've just got so much to do, and there's for blister paving, which I'll come on to, the most familiar stuff, the bobble paving, you know, there are 20 separate diagrams that go with that. Well, just it's like this, and if it's slightly different location, you do it slightly like that, and it basically ties people in knots, I think. And there's the simple fact that there are 7 different surfaces. I shan't ask you to run through your head what you think they are, because I'm going to go through them now, just for your information, because it kind of shows what the issues are that we've got. So surface 1, and probably the most familiar to us all, although there are of course a lot of people on this call who will be familiar with others, especially those that affect cycling, is the blister paving. And on the left is the classic sort of plan diagram, and on the right is a diagram of what it might look like in certain locations. If I can just stop for a moment on this particular diagram, however, I think one of the examples, or perhaps the best example of why this guidance needed looking at is that the statement of core purpose for blister paving is that we essentially, you use this blister paving to let people who are blind and partially sighted know where there is essentially a transition from a safe place, a footway, to an unsafe place, the carriageway, where that transition isn't delineated by a detectable curb height. So you can see the diagram here, you've got a dropped curb, and so we put blister paving there. Really clear. Use blister paving where you can't use the curb to detect the difference between footway and carriageway. That's what it says. But what's this thing here? I don't know if you can see my cursor flapping around in this thing at the back. This is what's called a stem, or sometimes referred to as a tail. What's all that about? That's not the edge. And within the document itself, despite having this statement of core purpose that you use this at the edge, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it says, oh, and you use it for stems as well. And the idea with the stem is that people walking along realize there's something here and turn towards that. When in doing our research, we ask people, how, when you meet that, if this is a part of the world that you don't know yourself, when you walking along and you meet that blister paving as a stem, how do you know it's a stem and not the edge? And the answer is nobody does, unless they are familiar with the street in question. So there are those kind of inconsistencies with it. Just a few photographs, you can see that there's a very long stem here leading to the crossing point. This is at a controlled crossing point, which is a formal crossing point with signals, as you can see. And the standard there is that you might use red but tactile paving, as you can see. Similar here, it's a controlled crossing, a zebra, so we use red blister paving. Here it's uncontrolled, it's just an edge, so we use buff blister paving. That's what the guidance says. Now, one of the issues with that is that it's become quite confusing. We use buff, we definitely use it here. We use red for crossings. The issue really, and this is touched upon by the guidance, is about tonal contrast, dark against light, essentially. And as you can see from that one, certainly on a sunny day, there's not much tonal contrast there. And equally, the same street scene actually just along from that one I just showed you. Again, not too much tonal contrast here. So one of the things, again, we're looking at in the review is how do we stress the issue? So it's not just about whether it's buff or not, it's about what the tonal, or red, it's about the tonal contrast, bearing in mind that this is quite fresh in the example I'm showing you here. In a few years' time, everything will just look pretty grey and grimy. It's not standing out. So that's one thing. The second surface is corduroy, which is 8 ribs like this, and it's commonly used at the top and bottom of steps. It's actually called hazard warning surface, and its core statement of definition is this: when you encounter this surface, it means hazard, proceed with caution. So it doesn't mean stairs, but it's most often found in the context of steps like this. So you know that something is coming up. I think there's a recognition, for obvious reason, that you can't tell everybody, you can't use tactile paving to tell everybody exactly what's going on here. And it is also used here. Actually, this is not far from where you live, Brian. It's in Harpenden. There you can see there's some corduroy surfacing, which is telling people crossing it that they are transitioning from a footway, where I'm standing taking this photograph, into a shared area. You can see there's a cycle track crossing, the cycle path crossing. So you're going from a footway where only people on foot are supposed to be, to an area where there might be people on cycles as well. It's used for that. It's also used for a number of other circumstances, such as entries to tram platforms and stuff like that. But it has the broad meaning of watch out. Essentially, watch out, you're transitioning from an area to another. The third surface in the existing guidance is another kind of blister paving, but if you were paying attention, you'll realize that this is offset, that those blisters are kind of offset one road from the next, whereas the other ones, the blister paving for for crossing points is they're all in line. The idea being at the crossing points, because they're all in line, people will be able to feel through the soles of their shoes about the directionality of the crossing direction, which frankly very few people can, and very few people know that that's what it's for. So this is another kind of blister paving which is supposed to be used. It's platform edge off street, which is to say on train platforms, such as here in Glasgow, and I think down in St Margaret's, actually in Twickenham. The idea, and it's kind of irrelevant to be perfectly honest about whether the orientation of the blisters. This is simply telling you you're near the edge of the platform, and it's important that you know that. And most people will take that signal that, you know, because they know, let's face it, if somebody finds themselves on a train platform and doesn't already know they're on a train platform, then there's a limited amount that to the extent to which the tactile.
Sorry, right, you just jump with the That's all right.
Hello? Okay, I shall carry on. This is in Manchester, in fact, and you might just be able to see here that somebody's done some fancy edge. This is not a platform edge, obviously, it's a key edge. And the tactile blisters are round their little hearts, which is rather beautiful, although technically non-standard. But again, it conveys, watch out, you're near an edge, if you know, which you would hope people do, that they are near that key side edge. This is the fourth surface, which we call lozenge, which is for use at tram platform edges. So this is platform on street. The other one, the offset blisters were platform edge off street, so railway stations and tube stations and so forth. This is for tram platforms, and this is what it looks like. This is a photograph from Manchester, and this is a photograph from Edinburgh. Very specifically for no stated reason, and this is one of the issues with the existing guidance. It just says don't. It says these are for tram platforms, but they are not for bus platforms. South Yorkshire, by and large, has ignored that, and so here's an example of lozenge paving at a slightly raised bus platform. Interestingly enough, if you look at that flag, this bus stop actually isn't in use, but I don't think that's because of its non-compliant tactile paving. Anyway, and there's a question there, well, why wouldn't you use it at bus stops? Why wouldn't you? You know, it's a public transport platform, and there are some places, certainly in Europe, probably very few in this country, where you have a bus stop which is more or less the same place, or perhaps along from. It tells a message. It's quite easy to detect or distinguish, differentiate from other types of surface. Why wouldn't we use this at bus stop, especially where there are platform edges? So that's a question that was raised, and we're trying to answer. The fifth surface is something that will be quite familiar to people who are involved in cycling, is what we call ladder and tram line. This is another linear one. You can see there are supposed to be 4 bars on a 400 mil by 400 mil block, as opposed to 8 different types of bars on the corduroy. And whether it's ladder or tram line is simply a matter of orientation. It's setting it through 90 degrees one from the other. The idea being that it helps, along with a delineator strip, which isn't on this drawing here, and often isn't, the strip between the two, the walking path here and the cycling path here. There's a delineator strip which is also part of the, if you see here, there's that sort of lozenge shaped delineator strip there. This is showing where you've got a cycle path next to a footpath, and there's a transition from these being separate alongside one another to shared. And this is a really poor example. There are very many poor examples that I could show you. I've got a library full of that. You'd be delighted to know. The idea being here that the different orientation, this is supposed to encourage cyclists to stay on this side, otherwise they'd have a rumble strip effect over there. Although, as some of you may know, and this is anecdotal, although there are some definite examples that are known, there is some established examples of the fact that if you don't hit that the tram line orientation quite right on a bike, especially on a wet day, that can basically grab your wheel and unsettle you. That's certainly you may know some people who've had that experience and find they've come off their bikes. So sometimes in practice, the effect of that can be counterintuitive, certainly counter to intent, which is people on bikes would rather suffer the rumble strip on the footway side and therefore deliberately go over to that side rather than risk being tramlined. at that thing. As another example of this arrangement from Kendall. It's also just extremely messy. And one of the problems that we have with that is as if everything else isn't perfect on either side, and again, you can see in this example, you've got a white line, which is very hard to detect. So it would be very easy for people on foot who are partially sighted to not know which side they are on or supposed to be on. So when they get to this tactile arrangement, they have no idea what it means. Frankly, most people have no idea what it means anyway, and that's something I'll come on to. But also because it's linear, and this is less forgivable but entirely commonplace, we often find that this is an example from Manchester, which Brian I'm sure will know quite well. I don't know if you can quite see here, but this is tramline paving set in tramline formation here on the cycle side. Let's forget about everything else you can see in that picture. And this is the ladder side here, except it's actually corduroy paving. So it's telling people a completely different message from what it's supposed to be doing. This should be that here, instead of it being the 8-bar corduroy, it should be the 4-bar tramline set in the ladder orientation. And here's another example of, and this is a really good example, I think, for some brand new development down in Barking Reach that I took a few years ago, where the poor designer has just desperately tried to do tactile paving because it needs to be important. So you can see there's got some blister paving there, which of course doesn't contrast well with the surface beyond at all. It's a fairly lightly trafficked access point anyway. There's loads of it, and both the ladder and the tram line here, this should be the tram line here, and the ladder there are formed of corduroy. This is brand new. And so that's not just like a maintenance error or something like that. They simply put the wrong thing down. The sixth form, which is not often seen in this country, seen a lot on the continent, is another linear form where there are 5 bars, not 4 for ladder and tram line and not 8 for corduroy. So you can start to see what the issues might be with here. This is called guidance path. And the point here is that you are supposed to walk along it, that's the idea, is that you can follow it to where you're going, hence the term guidance path. And for people who have a ball on the end of a long cane, it sits in the groove and you can follow it along. My personal take is this would be the perfect surface to use for stems of blister paving. Again, forget about what you can see at the far end. That's an interesting type of blister paving unit, a small one, which is often used to try and avoid having to have too many cuts. But of course, there are lots of fractures that can go wrong there anyway. And let's overlook the fact that the blister paving provision here doesn't cover the whole of the flush area, which is everything you can see in that picture. But the idea here is there's a directionality about the guidance path that takes you to the blister defined crossing point. There's a certain amount of logic about that, and it's something you see a lot on the continent. It's pretty rare, however, guidance path in this country. I say that's in Kendall. This is in Sheffield. You can see actually here's some guidance path taking you through to a bus stop platform, which is, you can just see perhaps in the lozenge there. But this is probably more familiar occasionally in stations. There's certainly a lot of it, Clapham Junction Station, the overbridge, if you're familiar with that, rubber stick down guidance paving there, perhaps in shopping centres and places like that. But it's very little used in this country. My personal take is it should be used more, except we're now in a situation where the standard practice of using blisters for stems is so endemic that the feeling is that we just need to stick with that. I kind of understand that pragmatically. Frankly, that's why even 20 odd years ago, it was used that way. In that case, there was enough tactile paving stems using blister paving back then that it was felt that actually the best way to go was to keep doing that. And of course, there's been a lot more delivered since then. And the feeling is it would be more confusing than otherwise to use a more logically sound, thoughtful surface for stems. The final surface is called the information surface, which actually was made of neoprene. And the idea, it gave you a little sort of springy surface, and it would tell you, for example, you're near an ATM when you're near a telephone kiosk. And here's a photograph of the information surface, which is to say, nobody I know or have spoken to or have ever seen and Googled can show me a photograph of that in action. It just doesn't seem to exist. Even though it was defined as being one of these surfaces 20 odd years ago. It just doesn't seem to be. Seriously, if anybody out there has got a picture of some of this stuff, I'd be very glad to see it. Perhaps you could send it to Brian. You can read about what we found in the last stage of research in this document here, which is you can click on if you're interested. I think it's kind of interested if you're in that, because what we did was, in trying to work out how we should update guidance, let's actually speak to users about what their experience of it is. And one of the things we found there was, surprise, surprise, back in the day, there was an intention that in addition to producing the guidance, there would be training for people, blind and partially sighted people who needed to use it. That never happened. And you'll see the consequences of that in a moment. But we also wanted to understand from practitioners, and so we did a lot of, we did a few focus groups and some survey work here to ask practitioners very frankly why they figured that what was delivered was often not what they were supposed to deliver. We also had a literature review, which was very interesting in a variety of ways. And one of the things we discovered from that was, perhaps in the classic UK way, the reason we have 7 surfaces is because way back when we were starting to research this formally, it was an idea, incidentally, that came from a designer in Japan. Way back when we started to look at it formally, we started with, in this country, the researchers, oh, here's 20 different types of surface that might be doing that, and then boiled it down. And of course, once you've got that many, you're bound to have quite a large number. If you look internationally, you look at the Japanese guidance, the international standard, and almost everywhere else, there are just two basic patterns, which is blister for the edges and guidance paths to get you through spaces, including to get you to those edges. Really simple, straightforward. That's what happens in lots of other places, virtually everywhere else. In fact, nowhere is as complex as Britain is on this. But we are where we are. That said, even though it's quite simple on a continent, doesn't mean it's the practitioners always get it right. You might be familiar with this with yourself if you're a giant nerd and you think it's quite simple. There's only 2 types and it's like that and it's like that, and they're often quite different. So here's a fantastic example I took last summer in Galicia in northern Spain. There are some reasons actually why you might have an unmarked crossing, like on the right, and sort of an untactile crossing and a tactile crossing here, but there are no reasons why you would have it so that the person using the tactile crossing, again, you can see a linear form, but it's not our linear form of guidance path to get you to the blisters of the crossing, and you cross and there's nothing there. Well, actually there's a wall. And you're not certainly taken across a zebra. Incredibly confusing. And I share with you what many of you will often do, which is how can professionals create such a horrible mess, especially with relatively simple guidance. In defense of some of the arrangements you'll see in this country, it's fair to say that the guidance is more complex. Even so, just think about it for a moment, wouldn't you? Like, even on a plan, that shouldn't have looked right. However, you'll be more familiar with this, which is a classic example. This is also in Galicia of how this works out in stations, especially. And here you have your linear guidance paving taking you to some blister paving, which is an exchange point, so that you then find different directions to go. And if you get to the edge of the platform, which that is there in the buff color, you know you're at the edge of a platform. So a relatively simple arrangement, although could be considered to be relatively confusing. Just briefly, when we looked at the user experience, what we did was we had a couple of focus groups, one in England, one in Scotland. It's quite important to do that with different representative groups. We also had really quite a big online questionnaire of a survey of people with different types of disability, not just people who are blind and partially sighted, because obviously other people have an interest in it. And it was recognized from the outset that, for example, blister paving is very important for people who are blind and partially sighted, so they know where the edge is, so to speak. But it also can be extremely uncomfortable for people in wheelchairs and mobility scooters. And so there are issues of trade-offs that need to be recognized there. So we wanted to speak to more than just blind and partially sighted people. And we also went to 5 different cities and had a bunch of walk and wheelabouts, which is extremely helpful. So we could go into some of the details more easily. Here's a photograph of some of that. And I'm going to come back to this later, not too much later. Brian, you'd be glad to know. I'll stop reasonably soon. You know, one of the things with all of this, especially as designers, it's not reasonable to think that you will know how different people with different abilities and disabilities can access the street scene. Do your work with them. make the effort. It's time well spent. Apart from the fact in terms of your own development and understanding of how these things work, how people with different abilities from different backgrounds access the street, it's incredibly helpful. The stuff you cannot learn from a book, from guidance, even if, unlike the existing tactile paving guidance, it's brilliant. The guidance isn't brilliant. The circumstances that people encounter are very challenging in all sorts of different ways. You cannot substitute for getting out there with people and understanding different perspectives. I thoroughly recommend it for any job you do. The photographs here are from some of the work we did, looking at tactile paving guidance update. I'll show you a couple more in a short while, which are done just for some of the street design schemes that we do. From the user responses then, there were 256 questionnaire returns, as I said, 172, roughly 2/3 of those people identified as being blind and partially sighted. And this was fascinating in a way, although frankly what we expected, which was about 3/4 of those people correctly understood the meaning of the blister surface, but that's still a quarter who didn't really know what it meant, had some vague idea perhaps, or none at all. These are people for whom it's for, and even then only 3/4 is the most important, the most common service, didn't really know what it was for. Half of the people responding, half of those 172 people, understood the meaning of the corduroy surface, and only 15% of everybody else understood at least one of the others. So it falls off a cliff, the understanding, the recognition of what these things are for. You've got 7 surfaces intended for people who are blind and partially sighted. Most blind and partially sighted, a good proportion of blind and partially sighted don't even know about the most common thing, don't know what it means. Half the next one, and then the rest of the other surfaces are barely known. Which was really important and shows perhaps 2 things. One, the limited value perhaps of some of the less well used surfaces, but also the importance of engaging with users about what these surfaces are and what they're for. Research into practice involved us going to a number of places. Interestingly enough, I don't see that first bullet point. Areas known to have examples of non-compliance. This is how it was expressed in our brief, which is exactly everywhere. Because you will know if you know this, the non-compliance, intentional and unintentional, sorry, very little intentional non-compliance, I'm sure, but it's just non-compliance is everywhere. We went to the places, we conducted interviews with officers to help us shape a survey, and then we spoke to officers from 20 different local authorities of different types from around the country, 27 officers from those 20. And what they told us was there's one brilliant principle at the beginning of the tactile paving guidance, which is still going to be there and should be there, which is the layout of areas, pedestrian areas, should be simple, logical, and consistent. It's a brilliant principle. It's established in the existing guidance, and then having appeared essentially on page 1, the rest of the 80-90 pages make it less simple, less logical, and less consistent, which is a real issue and one of the things we're trying to iron out, obviously. Often the confusing layout is that people are trying to look at so many different diagrams and trying to do the rest thing. It's a bit like when you're decorating and doing anything at home. You'll find there isn't a single perpendicular wall in the world, and no angles at the corner of your walls are 90 degrees. In exactly the same way, streets are very awkward and difficult and don't conform to nice, simple patterns. Again, we found that practitioner awareness for blisters is very well known, for corduroy quite well known, and a bit for land and tram lines, especially those involved in cycling arrangements, and others are not well known at all. There was the concern, as I've already pointed out, that the linear ones are often confused. There is awareness of the anecdotal reports and a relatively small number of reports about, but there's no research on the slipping. And they're also aware that quite often some of the reasons that tactile paving doesn't go in is that there's no site supervision. There was something linear on the van. The guys loaded the van up and it had corduroy, so they shoved that down, even though the plan suggested something else, because the contractors themselves don't know the difference. Just quickly moving on to the broader issue of inclusive, where does that all sit with inclusive design? You may be familiar with this document. If you're not, I urge you to get a bit more familiar with it. The Inclusive Transport Strategy that was published by the government in 2018, a couple of years ago. Sadly, it's best known for specifically talking about shared space, and I'm simply not going to get into that today, not least because I don't think we should talk about shared space, because we should be talking about what is an accessible street. However, in touching upon shared space and elsewhere, it mentioned the Equality Act, which I think is the key issue at stake here, and applies to the provision of tactile paving. It's not just let's just stick a thing down that we're supposed to stick down. Let us do inclusive design, and the Equality Act puts the framework around that for us. Unfortunately, as I say, that particular document focused, or rather a lot of the focus on it was just on the very small number of paragraphs about the pause on shared space. But I wanted to talk about that in the context of the Equality Act, because although technically speaking, the government did ask for a pause on shared space, whatever that is. What I felt at the time, what I've always felt and still feel now is this isn't about what you're calling a thing, whether it's shared space or whether it's not. It's, are we performing our duties under the Equality Act? Are we basically doing inclusive design? And so you should know about the Equality Act, and also you should know about the public sector equality duty. It may be your job, and you should definitely do this. If it's not your job, it's still worth looking at what these documents say. I'll go first to the public sector equality duty, but this is the only slide for that. And unfortunately, in the Equality Act, of course, there's all these parts, chapters, and paragraph numbers. Essentially, that public authorities must have due regard to eliminate discrimination, harassment, and especially, obviously, that applies to disabled people, but lots of other people with what is called protected characteristics, which is defined elsewhere. But there's a specific issue about discrimination arising from disability, and I think that's something I just want to open up, and we can perhaps, if there's time, have a discussion, but something I would just draw to your attention. This particular issue about one of the things we often encounter is somebody who's disabled says, I don't like this, and somebody else who has perhaps a different ability says, no, it's fine for me, and somebody else who's not disabled at all says, but I want this other thing to happen. The Equality Act is often spoken of as though it makes you do things that some people you might be speaking to say this is how it should be. What's really important, and on a couple of occasions the Equality Act uses this phrase, which is essentially you as a public authority are not discriminating against somebody with a disabled person if the thing you are doing can be shown to be a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. A really important thing, which is, you know, what people are saying about whether they feel discriminated against or whether a certain design makes things difficult for them is really important, and we need to take that into account. There may be, however, reasons why you can't achieve that for them, because there are overriding things. In other words, what you're doing, you're pursuing a legitimate aim, and this what you might be doing to make life more difficult, perhaps for one user or group of users, may be proportionate in the context of the greater good of the legitimate aim you're pursuing. And all I can say about that is, again, so I just want to refer to some more photographs. You can see Brian in at least one of these, a couple of these. This is some of us doing our work, the work that we do, walking around streets with people who can help us understand better what the needs of different users are and how that should affect our design work. But then I just wanted to finish with this, and specifically in the context of some of the stuff that a lot of you on this call are interested about, but in the context of also the Equality Act, the public sector equality duty, and this is exactly of a proportionate, of a legitimate aim. And here is a bus stop bypass in London, and you will be familiar, I'm sure, many of you, with the fact that actually some people who are blind and partially sighted have referred to arrangements like this as no-go areas. We can't have these, this is bad for us. That is an entirely legitimate perspective that they have. How do we deal with that? One of the things we need to deal with is the fact that in growing cycling is a really important thing. It's a legitimate aim. It's necessary in terms of our urban transport policies, in terms of dealing with climate mitigation, all that kind of thing. Therefore, arrangements where people who are blind and partially sighted might find difficulties with getting from the footway to the bus stop bypass, that is an issue, that is a challenge, that is something we really have to work harder at addressing. It doesn't, however, mean that we can't do bus stop bypasses. It means that we have to think about how we design for cycling in the vicinity of bus stops. And there are other ways of thinking about it as well. It's what I suppose I'm trying to point towards is the fact there's no binaries. This is right, that is wrong. It's quite complex, and that's really difficult sometimes for designers, but it's absolutely incumbent on us to engage with that complexity and not just go, oh, they said no, or, oh, I don't care, we're doing cycling. We have to think about this. And therefore, I found this photograph several years ago now of some people objecting to some bus stop bypass arrangements up in Enfield. And I remember at the time there's a lot of, oh, look at the moment, which is, One of the things that I would just want to finish with in the context of this, in fact, it is my final slide, is just this idea of whose subjective safety we're talking about. One of the things I would reflect upon in terms of the way in which the climate for the provision of facilities to enable cycling in this country has changed in the last decade has been because cycling campaigners very effectively asserted the issue of subjective safety, which is we don't care about the stats. What we know from what we say ourselves, or what we know from research elsewhere, is that it's not about whether stats will show you how likely I am to get knocked down. It's that I am simply not going to cycle, and I'm not going to let my kids cycle an elbow's distance away from a 38-tonner. I don't care that it's highly unlikely to happen that I will get hit by that vehicle. I feel unsafe, and therefore you need to protect me or get rid of those vehicles from whichever street I'm on. I simply want to finish this, therefore, by saying that idea of subjective safety applies to people who say, I am unsettled, disconcerted, and fearful, perhaps of something like a cycling bypass. We have to respect that and deal with it, rather than saying, oh, it's not the big, statistically, it's irrelevant. It's the cars that are going to kill you and knock you down. That's true to some extent, but it's not the right way to deal with this. Instead of just saying the issue you've got, this thing you say you feel unsafe or nervous about, it's something as designers and others, I think campaigners, we need to engage with seriously. And that's inclusive design. It's a bit messy. It deals with all sorts of people who have lots of different needs, but we've got to get involved in that rather than just wish it away, or to assert, for example, that our thing is more important than theirs. We may well have a legitimate aim, but is our response proportionate? That's difficult, that's complex, we need to engage with it. And I will leave you there. Thank you very much, Brian.
Yeah, hopefully we'll get some questions in on that. That was brilliant. I really like the bit. It seemed like the most British thing ever, that we know the tactiles don't work and people don't respond to them, and there are good solutions, but it'd be too embarrassing to change it now. That's the almost Armstrong and Miller.
Seemingly it was too embarrassing to change it back in 1998. It's all got worse, but it's kind of where we're at.
We're all in with the embarrassment. We're just going to have illegible streets for blind and partially sighted people forever, aren't we? Or will we? Has anybody got any questions for John? I thought it was brilliant, John. Anybody got?
Well, a lot there, Brian, actually. Basically, the stuff we've had in Glasgow has been bad because they've installed the tactile for going on the blind person's walking side on the cycle route. So it's as if the cycle route's that way. A whole load of stuff about bus stops. Bus stop was illustrated. It's got a 6-sheet advertising poster at the end of the bus shelter, which immediately blanks the view out of approaching cyclists, immediately adjacent to where people are going to be crossing from. And John didn't raise the installation for tramline paving is it's not to be at a corner or a bend where cyclists are turning. Fred Offen, if people remember Fred from DETR, was actually involved in some of the testing at TRL, where they sprayed the tramline tactile paving with a mixture of washing up liquid and water, and then proceeded to try and ride over it on bikes. And that's why the profile is very, very specifically set, and why occasionally councils have come unstuck and contractors have come unstuck by installing the wrong profile when people have crashed. So some thoughts on that?
No particular thoughts beyond the fact that my personal take would be that we should not have ladder and tramline paving. Nobody else has it. And actually, to be perfectly honest, there's so little of it now, and so much of it is done very badly. I think there's a real opportunity to I'm not sure that at the moment that's going to happen. It comes back a little bit to what Brian was saying about the inertia effect of this is a thing we have got, and therefore taking it away is different. LTN 120 does refer to it, although essentially just refers to the guidance. One of the real challenges in this is, and I quite understand and appreciate this from the DFT's point of view, a huge amount of research went in this back in the day. And actually, you can't change that, even though we've done quite a lot of work over a couple of years now with the TRL team. You can't change that just on the basis of what quite a lot of people say, and what, frankly, on the basis just of what you might consider to be common sense. What are you going to replace it with? And my take on that is, and what I think will hopefully happen, but it won't be in a hurry, is that something like, I can't remember what's the Pamela test bed that Nick Tyler at UCL has been running for a while. They're building a completely new thing, even better and improved. And I suspect they will need to have some research there. There's a real challenge, Dave, which is we have this thing, it's out there. Can we just say, well, we shouldn't do it anymore? What does that leave us with then in terms of what is already out there? To be honest, going through this process has been just as it's been really an interesting insight into how you get change at this sort of national level in terms of national guidance. You know, and going back to what Brian said at the beginning, you know, we have to keep doing this because we've always done it. It's quite hard to stop that, and that's just been real insight for me. That doesn't mean to say what's there is wrong and what we would do is right. It just is quite difficult because there's so much that's there that some people have some understanding of. My personal take on the Tactile, just to finish on the ladder and tramline, is simply there's not that much there. Nobody knows what it means really, other than everyone on this call, but that's about it. And that this will be an opportunity, but I'm not sure it's going to be grasped. And I can understand why. It's, you know, speaking as from the perspective of civil servants. So.
Simon Monk, did you want to come in? Ask a question?
They're kind of two interrelated kind of things. One was, I'm just fascinated whether part of your work is going to do anything on those delineator strips. You know, we've seen paint, we've seen raised edges, and we've also seen a load of folks from the visually impaired community and from other disability access organizations have very, very conflicting kind of views on what's a step down a curb level that's appropriate might be, how we interact with forgiving curves and 30-degree curves and things like that. So I think that was the first point, and related to that, I guess, and it's something I'm always fascinated on, is that kind of conflicting views thing that you touched on at the end, which is how on earth, you know, and as a campaigner, I'm constantly thinking about this, is how on earth you bring people in and find, you know, the best possible solutions for everyone, try and listen to everyone. And at the same time, you have to kind of hold in your head that there are some, you know, there are different disability access groups and different groups of people with protected characteristics who currently are saying very oppositional things to each other about what appropriate design is in terms of tonality, height of curb, you know, what that means for other things, you know, all sorts of things in this area. And I guess from my view, that subjective safety thing is one of the things that I feel both uncomfortable and comfortable about, is there's a real body of evidence about cyclists feeling subjectively unsafe. So I really hope there is a body of evidence being built about visually impaired people feeling unsafe, how much people are changing their travel habits, etc.
Yeah. All right, Simon. Yeah, in the time we have to us, which is virtually none, I suppose, so I'll say a couple of things, but what I said there, then, which I think we have to do now, which is we do need to really embrace complexity. It's a real challenge, and we don't, and there will be no right answer. There never is, right? Because actually what I want from a given street changes by time of day, right? And that's just me, and everybody can do that, and whatever their ability or disability. So we have to engage with it and accept the fact there won't be a right answer, but we must try much harder than we should. So for example, Dave Holliday mentioned some specific example of, I'm not quite sure which one, but actually something in Glasgow. In a lot of the walkabouts we've been doing on our work in Glasgow, what we have found is the basic level of list of provision is shocking. And I'm not picking on Glasgow, you could say that anywhere. And so one of the things that I would say we could focus on a lot, and this is one of my takes on the shared space debate, which is you could stop anything that looks or might feel like shared space ever happening. Right, okay, brilliant, potentially Pyrrhic victory, right? Because if you focus more on, can we just get ordinary, because it's quite easy to do, just that, where all the edges we've got that are reasonably flush, let's put blister paving on them. That would transform the the navigability and the safety of the urban realm for so many blind and partially sighted people. We don't get the basics right. We should do that better. I'll simply touch on one of the issues mentioned there about heights, which is what's interesting is the existing tactile paving guidance defines flush, in other words, a non-detectable edge, where you have to have blister paving, as anything less than 25 mil. So that, oh, if we've got a curve bigger than that, you know, so and then there's lots of talk about, no, hang on, it's 50, no, it's 60, no, it must be 120. And that's where we get in. So the guidance says that actually, based on purely on the tactile paving guidance, it's actually not really addressing directly the issue of what's a detectable curve edge, but actually it's essentially saying it's 25 mil. We know it's not. You know, that a lot of people can't detect that. And besides, 25 mil can subside very, very easily over time. And so what you get to is a circumstance where we need to try and get some kind of midpoint that we can agree is a reasonable thing, and around about 50-60 for a thing there. Just quickly on the issue of the delineator strip, I think one of the things that the guidance will say, there are obviously different opinions like this, the delineator strip is relatively easy for people who are sweeping using a long cane to detect if they're walking alongside it. Okay, much more difficult to detect if you're walking across it. Nevertheless, there's some research behind it. It seems to, it makes a certain amount of sense where you haven't got the money or the engineering or the scope to do a full curb height, whatever that curb height might be. And one of the things I'm sure the guidance will say is, if you have got parallel walking and cycling paths, you really must have this delineator strip. That's much better than paint, which is hopeless. And so the idea of outlawing paint, so to speak, and making sure, if you've got those parallel paths, that's a step forward. It doesn't solve it. To some people, it's not an issue, but it is much better than the idea. We need to get out of the thinking that if you're going to have these parallel paths, which you may well have at the same level, you absolutely must have a delineator strip. And for me, the interesting thing is the delineator strip is lost in the chapter on ladder and tramline. It's possibly the most important thing in that chapter, is so you know the difference. And then if you terminate the ends or the transitions with just corduroy, at least you know it's a change. Okay, that may be the best we could hope to do. But yeah, sorry, I've said enough. But certainly, I would say paint has got to be outlawed for that purpose.
Brilliant. Mark Strong, do you want to come in? Might have to make this the last question because we're overrunning.
Thanks. I'm taking some light relief from listening to a very infuriating committee meeting in Brighton where Labour are about to vote down doing anything, having changed tack from 6 weeks ago when they were in power. Anyway, John, I was interested about the practicalities. You showed worn down tactiles, yeah. And it's all very well having the best guidance in the world, but there are two things that get in the way of doing it for real. One is the tendency of contractors to just throw any old stuff that they happen to have in the back of the van down because they think it looks like what they have in their plans and they don't know the difference in corduroy and tramline. And I've put up on the chat a picture of the level in Brighton where they had a mix and match approach to both in the same section. And the other is long-term maintenance. They get cracked by vehicles running over them. They wear down where people tread over them. They get the leaves, as we know, building up into them. And actually, over time, they become less and less useful anyway. So are those two practical issues? Kate, I think Kate referred to this in comments as well. Are those practical issues about actually delivery of the best? You could have the best standards, but if you do them badly, it's irrelevant what the standards are.
Well, so two things. One of the things we found from as I've touched on in our practitioner users, yes, there's definitely a real issue with actual delivery and site supervision. Obviously, that's a practical, it's a resource issue. But I think we think on the whole that would be helped if there were fewer surfaces to choose from. Obviously, that's an issue. With the best from the world, I think that's something that it's easy to excuse. You know, the design officers. Yeah, the guys did it wrong. Well, you should be going out there scrutinizing them. And if you know what you're doing, you get them back the next day. So it's a real issue. It's something we will highlight in the guidance, but that is achievable. On the wear and tear, I think one of the things we'll be saying maintenance is something we're certainly going to be bringing out very strongly. And I think that one of the things we will say about that is that you need to think from the outset about the materials you are using, therefore, in terms of that. Stuff wears, right? But granite will wear a lot less and concrete will wear a lot less quickly than sandstone, for example. And obviously sandstone depends which quarry you got it from and which bit of which quarry, frankly. But I think one of the things we're saying is the maintaining the differential, the height differential between the blister and the is obviously key. So you need to think about that when you specify your materials to begin with. And although, for example, in heritage areas where sandstone paving is very important, perhaps that one of the things is the fact that actually if you get a color contrasting thing, which doesn't have to be sandstone just for that bit, that's a way of doing it. So get a darker granite, for example, just for the edge treatment, where the rest of it is sandstone. That would kill two birds with one stone potentially. No, so basically, yes, site supervision and maintenance really critical considerations, but you need to take a whole life view to that.